kind of shortly after I got here was Dr. Laura Gerald, our current president, arrived. And what she was really thinking about is equity and equity as an outcome. And so we really started thinking about, okay, so you're working on substance misuse in this community. What's the goal? You might be working on equitable food system in this community, but what's the goal? You really have to name your goals to be transparent to community, to help build public will towards addressing a certain issue, and you have to follow the outcome, because intent is one thing, but outcomes are a different thing. So you may not mean to create um, a school plan that segregates all your schools, but if that's the outcome, you need to change something. So,
This is the Public Health Millennial Career Stories podcast, where you'll hear about diverse career stories, career strategies, get tips, and learn from others to help you in your public health career journey. If you want to learn about public health careers, or just hear public health stories, stay tuned because you won't want to miss this. Welcome to the Public Health Millennial Career Stories podcast, episode number 64. Hi everyone, Umar Richards here. Thank you all so much for joining me for once again another great episode of Public Health Career Stories. Before anything, make sure that you subscribe, that you like this video, that you leave a review. 5-star review would be greatly appreciated. And you share this with a friend. If you want to support the show, you can go to buymeacoffee.com/the PH Millennial and support there as well. I thoroughly enjoyed this conversation with my boss. I learned a lot more about him and his story and how he got to the trust than I did before. And I know it's going to be informative to you all too. And this is definitely going to soon be part of our orientation at the trust. They're going to have to watch the podcast because I had our president on and now we have the director of programs. But without further ado, here's today's episode. Enjoy. Today we have the most humorous boss I've had and someone I'm truly amazed by, especially his memory and quick recall ability. He's gotten his Bachelors of Arts in Philosophy and African American Studies at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, then went on to get two masters, a Master's of Arts in African American Studies at the University of Massachusetts at Amherst, and a Master's of Arts in Journalism and Mass Communications at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. He is currently the director of programs at the Cape Reynolds Charitable Trust and my boss. We have Adam Linker, ME or MEA, MA. I don't know how you do it if you have double masters. Welcome to the
I'm
show.
great.
How are you doing?
Good. How are you doing?
Doing well, doing well. How have things been going for you, like coping during the pandemic from start to now?
Yeah. Well, I think we are all feeling a little bit better about getting back out into the world. And as you know, our job, we want to be like out in community, meeting people in Raleigh at the Capitol, kind of talking to folks. And it seemed like we were able to get out and do more of that. And it's a little depressing to have to be kind of retrenching and putting our masks back on and being cautious again. Especially, I have a son who's too young to get a vaccine, so unfortunately, I was feeling pretty good about it, and now feeling a little sad about this retrenchment.
Yeah, I absolutely understand that, and I do feel the same way, and especially with children, and then school starting back up soon, everything is kind of up in the air, and it's also going to start getting cold very soon as well, which also brings along all the cold-like flu symptoms that come along with it as well. So it's going to be an interesting time going into the end of the year, that's for sure.
The fall weather is nice in North Carolina, but the once it gets cold, yeah, you have to retreat back inside.
Sounds good. Sounds good. Look forward to more fall weather around here. So tell us, how do you identify, and then tell us a little bit about your personal background.
So I identify as straight white male, married. I have two kids, a 12-year-old girl and 8-year-old boy. So she's able to get the vaccine, thankfully. Um, And what was the second question?
Tell us a little bit about your personal background.
Okay, so I grew up in Raleigh, North Carolina. Um, Went to public schools. My dad was a professor of agriculture, and my mom was a school teacher. And um, you know, I went to undergrad, like you said, at UNC. Kind of played soccer my whole life, as you know, big soccer fan. And did a lot of, I'm an Eagle Scout, did a lot of scouting growing up, lots of camping and kind of outdoor activities. I didn't realize it. I mean, I spent all my childhood like skating and shooting air rifle and stuff, and now these are Olympic sports. So I didn't know that I spent my whole life in Olympic training, but kind of a rural area right outside of Raleigh. So grew up there and did my undergrad at UNC, and really like when I was probably like end of high school, early college, sort of getting much more into activism and like student government and all that stuff. Um, so then really fell in love with African American studies and wanted to go on and do my PhD, but stopped at my master's and went back to school to another program and got my master's in journalism, like you said. So spent most of my life in North Carolina. I was born, my dad was finishing his PhD at University of Florida, which I know you appreciate. So we are Gators. um, and so when I was born, he was doing his field research, and so I was actually born in Dothan, Alabama, but I spent my whole life in North Carolina, um, and lived for a while in Massachusetts doing that PhD master's program, and but was excited to get back to the South because as cold as it gets here, it's nothing compared to Massachusetts. I was entirely unprepared for that. So,
Yeah, I can imagine. It's probably like similarly like how I was very unprepared for going to Alaska from Florida. I was not ready for that.
that's a much bigger change, but North Carolina to Massachusetts was kind of bad, but yeah, Florida to Alaska was really dramatic.
Yeah,
And I
yeah.
didn't like the first time there was like a huge snowstorm, which happened all the time, but I didn't realize it. And I mean, I just thought like you didn't go to class, you know, and people are like, no, you get up and like shovel your car out of the snow. I was like, what? Things happen here when it snows. I mean, here we just shut everything down. We can't afford snow plows and stuff. So yeah, that was a culture shock. So I went out and like dug it out with the little pan with my broom, you know,
Yeah.
or anything. I was just like doing it. Somebody let me borrow a shovel. That was bad.
Okay, okay.
Retreated back down south.
Yeah, fair enough, fair enough. I don't think, yeah, I haven't had to shovel any snow like that, thankfully, when I was in Alaska. So I'm glad about that part
Oh
of
wow.
things.
Okay, yeah, that's great.
Yeah,
Yeah,
thankfully, like where I live, they had a snow plow that came and used to snow, like just get all the snow out, so we didn't really have that issue.
in New England they like plow the roads, but then it plows on top of your car, you know, and so you have to dig out what they plowed. So you can access the road, but your car is buried. But when you go out at like 6 o'clock in the morning and you can't even see your car, I mean, it's like, oh my gosh. But yeah.
Yeah, what
I
a
mean,
time.
there's lots of organizing potential and like lots of good things you can be doing in the South, luckily. So I'm much more a Southerner at heart. So I like to be down
Fair enough, fair enough. And I know you mentioned a couple of other things there that I just noted down that I'm going to follow back up on when it makes sense in the interview.
here. Okay,
So, what does public health mean to you as we start?
that's a good question. Public health is I'm not, you know, as you can tell from my weird background that I described, not a public health person. Um, but I really think of public health as um, really thinking of it as population health and doing the things that we need to do as a society to really prevent sort of excess deaths, unnecessary deaths, and disease. So obviously, we're all going to die of something at some point. Um, but when you look at, for example, and this is sort of how I frame it or think about it, is the tremendous disparities, in the United States are sort of proof that we have people who, in certain zip codes or because of the color of their skin, are dying at a population level and getting sicker sooner than other people. And so you have that disparity as sort of evidence that we have many people who are dying and getting sick and really debilitated. If you think about, for example, the disparities with amputation from diabetes, people who really are experiencing these debilitating sort of diseases and disparities at an unnecessary rate. And that's sort of what, to me, the focus of public health, at least as I work in it, sort of adjacent to public health and philanthropy. That's how I think about it.
Yeah, no, I think it's important that you highlight like the population approach and the population way of viewing things, because that is what it is at its like core center. It's population and the community, and how we can improve the community and population health. Um, so going into your undergrad story, you got your Bachelor's of Arts in Philosophy and African American Studies at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. What was the thought process for you going into undergrad? Because you said your mother was a teacher, your dad was a professor in like agriculture. So
Yeah.
why philosophy and African American studies?
Yeah. So um, I had really tremendous history teachers kind of at different intervals, like in high school. My seventh grade history teacher was amazing. So I was just very interested in history for a long time. And so I thought I wanted to be a history professor, like my dad was a professor. Um, and so I started school at NC State, North Carolina State University, which is where my dad was a professor. So I didn't realize you had like a lot of options for colleges, but he was a Gator and a Wolfpack fan. So I was like an avid, state fan and stuff. And I absolutely loved NC State, and they had a great. I'd also just read sort of some philosophy as like a precocious high schooler, just randomly, picking it up. Um, and but I thought I wanted to be a history professor. So um, when I got to NC State, number one, I kind of I was into some activism and so forth, and um, just realized like I didn't have a lot of background in African American literature and history. So I kind of randomly took a survey course in African American literature. And that was it's Dr. Laurier was one of the first um, Black tenured professors at NC State. And she was kind of one of those life changing professors who just, um, you know, opened my eyes about a lot of things and was just like a tough love kind of amazing professor who taught me how to write. She taught me sort of grammar and all sorts of like how to really appreciate literature. And so, that kind of pulled me more in the direction. I thought I kind of wanted to do European intellectual history when I got to undergrad. And then that kind of pulled me in a different direction where I was like, I still want to do intellectual history. And I had studied German in high school and stuff. So that's why I kind of thought I wanted to do European history. Um, but then that kind of started pulling me in a different direction. But then when I was looking at the course catalogs, like UNC Chapel Hill is one of the best history schools in the country. And so their course catalog, I mean, they have like this thick of history classes you can take. Whereas NC State is an amazing school for history, especially for public history, studying museums and archives and stuff. But they did not have the same level of offerings at that time. They may now, but at the time they didn't have that. So I was like, I really want to be at UNC where I can like take a ton more courses. They have a much more robust African American history section. They have a lot more European history. So I decided to transfer to UNC because of that sort of more robust, course offering. So then I transferred, and that was awesome. I just got, I interestingly, like I started taking some African American history courses in the African American Studies department at UNC, and they just ended up being like much more challenging than the other American history classes I was taking at UNC. And so like people just like the professors are some of the best professors anywhere and just very rigorous and challenging. And so I've just been always attracted more to that. People who are like more challenging my thought process. I wasn't in college to like just skate along and not learn anything. In the history courses, a lot of the history courses, I felt like I could just kind of parrot back what I thought the professor wanted to hear, but I could never get away with that in African American Studies courses at UNC. They were very rigorous, and so I just kept taking courses and more and more courses in the department, and kind of became a fixture in the department where I would do kind of undergraduate research presentations and things like that, and just fell in love with it and really thought then that I want to do a PhD in African American Studies.
Okay, very good. Thank you. That was a lot of great information that I did not that I did not know about you. But that's awesome. Okay, so firstly, when you said that you initially started, you said that you were in like activism and student government. How did you get involved in both of those things? And
Yeah,
was that at NC State or was that at UNC?
at NC State. So um, I would say I was a little bit into things like, for example, when I was trying to get my Eagle Scout uh, award, the at the same time there was a lawsuit against the Scouts about allowing gay Scouts into Scouts, and I was kind of talking to my Scoutmaster about that at the time, just sort of saying, I don't know how I feel about Scouts and getting my Eagle Scout, because you kind of have to sit down and plan out your plan of action for getting your Eagle. And I was like, I'm not comfortable with the organization denying gay people rights. And he was like, well, gay people shouldn't have any rights. That's what this person said. The Scoutmaster said. So it ended up being like quite a conflict with me and scouting, but basically my dad gave me some very good advice at that time that I've never forgotten, which was, if you just stop now, everyone's going to say that you just had sour grapes and about the fact that you weren't able to meet this standard, like you couldn't cut it. And now you're just complaining about Scouts because you couldn't cut it. But if you get your Eagle Scout, then you will have a ton of influence to say, I believe that this organization should act differently. And by the way, I've got the highest award that this organization can offer. And so that's been I just think that was a very good bit of political advice that he gave me, and was true. I got my Eagle Scout and started speaking out and like joining organizations that were trying to change Scouts. And so I wouldn't put my kids in it personally because it's sort of like a paramilitary organization, but I do think it's gone through a lot of changes, and I think that was a good learning experience for me, and then got me more into kind of wanting to see things change. And then I went on to have like I had a summer organizing job with a group called Clean Up Congress that was campaigning against Senator Jesse Helms in North Carolina, who was a very far right, senator from North Carolina, opposed the Martin Luther King holiday, kind of was very anti-gay in many ways, and spoke out about, at the time especially, he was against sort of increased funding for HIV research and so forth. And so I did a worked with this campaign to basically go door to door against him. Um, and that was, another major learning experience, both from just being able to talk to people. And I think that's what I'm always interested in, is just really getting on the ground and hearing from people and their different perspectives and thinking, how can you build a different vision for moving forward given where everybody is. And that really allowed me to kind of get out across North Carolina and get to know people and their political views. And you just go door to door talking to people about politics, which is a good education. um, and then from there, I joined the NAACP and kind of did all sorts of other activism. I was early working on I was and did a little bit of time working with the Senate at the NC State, like trying to make internal change at the university and on the elections board. Um, I'm still a big lover of elections boards, but and then really just snowballed from there, like joining different organizations that were trying to build power or movement building in North Carolina.
Okay. That is awesome. That's awesome. Do you have any takeaways from you when you were doing that community organizing and stuff like that you wanted to share?
Any takeaways from community organizing? I think that, you know, there's some interesting things. I think one is that you always have to be conscious of how you can be of power dynamics and how you can be building power with people in partnership with people to really change decision making structures. And it's much more complicated than it seems once you get out in the world and really start trying to do that. um, but it should always be on your mind, like how you can, and I think this is through studying history but also just my own work, is um, you always have to be part of organizations and networks. You can't do any of it on your own or freelancing. um, you really have to be part of networks and organizations all the time, because that's what's going to get people moving. And then um, people are much more complicated than than you realize. People just have very complicated political views, and when you really sit down and talk to people, it's like no two people's political views are the same. And so if you think about that dynamic of you're trying to build a movement towards something, but no two people think the same thing about an issue, that's where the complexity comes in. And it's just so people would maybe people, when you're talking to them, would sound like they support they might sound like the most liberal Democrat you've ever met, and then they would be like, no, I'm voting for Jesse Helms. And you're like, pardon? But that's just the complexity of people. You never know, oh, he helped me get a passport quickly, and he, you know, he's my neighbor or something like that. Just random things sometimes.
Mhm.
But that's the complication of people and of movement building and of politics, I think.
Okay, that makes sense, and I think it goes back to what your dad said to you about to make the change or to be more effective in making that change is better that you stay within the organization, show them that you have been valuable, and then use that as a leverage to get the change from outside. Because I feel like a lot of people do try to complain about things, and they don't want to take part in the change that has to happen or be part of the organization. But it is so important that we do have that type of person inside fighting for the change for those on the outside to come in, or whatever that might look like.
Yeah, agreed. If you think about the great organizer Ella Baker from North Carolina, kind of a hero amongst organizers, I think. She was often dissatisfied with the organization she was a part of. So she was one of the main organizers of branches of the NAACP in the South in the 1950s and 60s. Um, and SCLC, she joined Southern Christian Leadership Conference to organize people. And at each juncture, she was dissatisfied with like either the male domination or the top down structure or the church pressure, from SCLC, like the religious affiliation kind of pressuring her. Um, but she wouldn't really leave an organization until she had really established a new organization or established a foothold in a new organization. So she wasn't really just organizing out on her own or trying to do just complain. She was like making change in the organizations and then going to where she felt like the next organization that could make the most progress was, until she helped found the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, and she was really their mentor. um, but to me, that's more like the historical lesson of that, of really being part of an organization and network.
Okay, yeah, that's great insights, and I definitely have to look more into Ella Baker now.
Ella Baker's from Halifax County, so
Is she?
yep,
That's
you'll hear a
awesome.
lot about her in Halifax.
Okay, well, that's good to know. Thank you. Like I feel like Adam just always drops all these different things in history that have happened, especially in North Carolina. I feel like you're just very knowledgeable about a lot of the different things that have happened around here. So that's awesome. So then, after your bachelor's, you decided to get your Master's of Arts in African American Studies at the University of Massachusetts at Amherst. So, what was the thought process for this? Was this so that you were planning to go and get your PhD?
Yes, so I was planning to get my PhD. So at the time, 1999, you were born, weren't you? Were you born in?
Yes.
Okay,
Yes.
I was gonna feel really bad, but there weren't many PhD programs in African American studies. I felt like lots of people would maybe go to like a history or philosophy PhD, sociology PhD with like a concentration in African American studies, but there weren't a lot of like PhD programs. Um, and so there was like Berkeley, UMass Amherst. Columbia had like you could do a master's in African American studies and then continue on and do your PhD in history. But I really wanted to do a PhD in African American studies. And UMass Amherst just had a fascinating history that I just thought would be, and then there was Temple, which was sort of the home of Afrocentrism and also a great department. Um, but there was a lot of history at UMass Amherst that I thought was just fascinating. It's an interesting mix of people. Um, they kind of like the department to form took over a dorm, and so they had took over this dorm and created New Africa House in the 1970s. And it had like in Western Massachusetts, it was hard for Black people in Western Massachusetts to find like soul food or get your hair done or anything. So like you could get food or your hair done in the basement. Like they were setting up all this whole structure at New Africa House. Um, and then they really recruited great people like the jazz musician Archie Shepp was there. It's the last place James Baldwin taught. That's where he was teaching when he passed away. Um, so James Baldwin was great, very close to a lot of the people there. Um, Michael Thelwell, who was Stokely Carmichael's roommate and one of the political directors of Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, is there. Um, Chinua Achebe was there. So it was like this fascinating like place of um, activists, intellectuals, like just fascinating place to be. And then W.B. Du Bois's papers are at UMass Amherst, interestingly, because there was a huge fight between Harvard and UMass Amherst to get his papers. And but Harvard was not as excited about the fact that he became a communist at the end of his life, and really like was a leftist and left the United States. And um, well, I think there's some dispute about whether people sort of labeled him a communist, but Herbert Apteker, who he left his papers to, was very leftist and communist, and so Herbert Apteker help get the papers at UMass Amherst as opposed to Harvard. So it's sort of another attraction of UMass is that the W.B. Du Bois papers and archive are there. So it was just an interesting place, and um, I don't know if there's any parallel sort of for kind of the collection of people who are there. And it was just you know, wouldn't trade that time for anything.
Okay, yeah, that does sound like it was a great time, and it really aligned with everything that you were trying to get from school. But how I know you spoke about it a little bit earlier, but how was the transition from North Carolina up to Massachusetts?
It was weird because it is like Western Massachusetts is very rural. Um, it is very white in Western Massachusetts. It's very cold, um, but it's a beautiful place. You know, I love Massachusetts. I love New England. It was really pretty in the fall. Um, the sort of um, intellectual um, environment and like cultural environment in the department was like amazing. You know, so it's a great department. Um, but it was interesting. Like I expected, I didn't spend a lot of time in New England, so I didn't really know a lot about it. But the politics were very weird too. Like I was used to North Carolina, where the politics are very much like there's like in Raleigh and Durham and so forth, there's like a large white population, large black population, growing Latinx population. And a lot of times the politics cut across racial lines in certain ways, um, in ways that I understood from being here my whole life. And then in New England, you just have like a much more complicated swirl of politics, or just a different kind of structure where you have um, many more different, like the Latinx population, like you have a much more different sort of folks coming from different places. Um, so you have a larger like Puerto Rican population, Dominican. Then there's like white people, what we would consider white people in the South are like identify very strongly with like different homelands. So like you have Portuguese people going to Portuguese clubs and like Irish people considering themselves Irish and going to Irish clubs. Um, so it's just kind of interesting that there's like this sort of different swirl of like ethnic populations and people kind of hold on to that in a different way. Whereas sort of the history of the South kind of created this amalgam of white people, you know, and black people, and that's where the politics are drawn. Those just in, I think I got a different sort of view of like politics and like ethnic conflict and political conflict in New England that, you know, gave me a better perspective on politics in the United States than I had from just coming from the South.
That was a very interesting insight there, and I don't think it's something that someone usually thinks about, but I definitely understand what you're meaning there, from a lot of what you're saying, and and then after, what was the thought process for getting the next master's? Was it that you decided you weren't going to pursue your PhD, or how did all of that play out?
Yeah, that's a good question. So, um, so really like I was at the point, so I did my comps and everything. So technically I'm all but dissertation in the department. Um, and then I had a research fellowship, you know, to work on a dissertation. And I came back to North Carolina. My wife was coming back in after law school. Um, and so we were, because when you do a law degree, you really have to choose where you're practicing. You have to pass the bar exam in that state. So we thought we wanted to live back in North Carolina. So we came back to North Carolina, and I was doing research and she was studying for the bar. And then I started sort of getting more back into some of the activism, writing, stuff like that. And I was like, I thought it would be very helpful to, I wasn't making a lot of progress on my dissertation. And I thought like, I could make more of a difference doing some of the writing that more people would be reading than doing academic writing. But I love both. I love being in archives. I love doing historical research, but I also like being out in the world and trying to make a difference. And I think sometimes when you're like at the academy, like, you know, people kind of tune you out a little bit when you're trying to say things about politics or social change or something. Um, and so that was sort of, I would say, ever since I got into my PhD program, it was always a conflict of like, do I really want to go into the academy? Which, once you start seeing more behind the scenes, you know, I didn't feel great about. Like, there's just a lot of, what I would say a lot is like, there's a lot of politics at the university internally. Um, but you know, if I'm going to spend my time doing politics, would I rather do like real politics out in the world or just politics at the university, dealing with like the internal politics? And so I just thought I'd rather be doing stuff out in the world outside of the academy, even though I love the academy, love the university. Um, and so I thought of journalism and mass communication and really thinking about how to write and communicate with people would be a better way to make a contribution. So I really needed a foot in the door there and to study it more. So I went back and did a second master's, really focusing on print journalism and communications.
And that makes sense. And I feel like that is an issue that a lot of people that I talk to in public health, studying public health, get into too. Like they see a lot of the academic side, and it's more like you can do a lot of this academic studies and stuff, but who's actually doing the work? And so there's
Yeah.
those two sides, and I feel like it's always that battling of how much research do you want to do before you actually put in the effort and the work to actually push those issues forward. So
Yeah. I
yeah.
think, yeah, if you like, academics in like history and so forth, like in policy, like really do set an important frame for how we think about certain issues. But on a day-to-day basis, you know, they're typically not the ones doing the communicating to people, you know, and the movement building and stuff. And so I wanted to have that frame, but do a little bit more of the direct communicating with people. And you know, not that many people read academics necessarily, so I wanted to have a little bit of a more influence.
Yeah, that makes sense. That makes sense. So just to be clear to people who are listening, you got your Master of Arts in Journalism and Mass Communications at UNC at Chapel Hill. So what were some takeaways that you had from getting this degree and learning more how to communicate with people and just journalism and writing and all of that?
Yeah. um, I love journalism school. It's just totally different than my training. And like in my PhD program, our first year is you just read a book a week. Your first year, you read a book a week and write a book review on it, and then go in and have to talk about that book review with like the smartest person you've ever met, various experts or whatever, and they're just like, you know, um, breaking down your logic and stuff. So embarrassing you sometimes, but it was just like very intellectually rigorous and like really challenging to like process that amount of information and make sense of it in the context of history and stuff. Um, Whereas I would say journalism school is more like a professional school, where it's like very intense balance of doing a lot of things. Like it's less just thinking and like rigorous analysis and more like producing all the time, like really refining your writing process, um, really getting at like how to edit, how to make things make sense to people, how to make complicated topics make sense, you know, really like how you investigate things, how you, what are different sources of information that you can like look into, how to follow different like, you know, interests or something down a trail and to reach conclusions. And so they're similar, but it was much more rigorous on the sort of writing, research, fast production of information. And so I think that combination was really helpful. Um, I was not, you know, I probably wrote a little more like an academic before. So I'm thankful for that experience of refining my writing and communication ability and being able to write more quickly, produce things that people want to read, and being able to synthesize information.
Okay. And are there any tips that you can share about being able to write more quickly and synthesizing information, or is that just like internally digested by now that you can't even explain how you do it?
That's a good question. Editing is very important. What really one of the like most important lessons I learned is the importance of editing and seeking out people who are good at refining and writing, who can give you constructive criticism. So that's one of the best parts about probably working at a paper or something, where editors very quickly are giving you feedback and criticism. And that's the good thing about a journalism school. Um, so if I would write something, which would happen a lot in the academy, I would write something and people would just be like, "Oh, that's great, good job." Like I wouldn't really seek that person out again for to give me feedback. I want like critical feedback that really like makes my writing better. And so I don't know, just really like seeking out the right resources and people, and editing is probably more helpful than anything. But journalism school just, it's like gets you to eliminate unnecessary words in your writing, eliminating cliches, really just getting things down to sort of basic sentence structure in a way that academics don't write, but is very important and like very impactful in ways that you don't really think about until you are reading a lot and trying to synthesize information. So I'm not a big fan of cliche or excess words, and all those things really are from journalism school.
Okay, makes sense. I think like being concise in your wording is something that's a lot harder than people think that it is, but it could be very important as you just stated. So with these two masters, did you know in your head that you wanted to go on to become like a journalist, or what was the thought process when you were thinking about after school, after your masters, what you would do?
Yes, I thought I wanted to be a journalist or doing advocacy and using my research and writing skills in advocacy. So I did I did think journalism was a good avenue for that, for making change, but I was also very open to working for like an advocacy organization, policy organization, and using those sort of writing skills to advance agendas or really try to make change.
Okay, that makes
I
sense.
didn't know exactly what I wanted to do, but I knew it would be either like journalism or advocacy
Okay.
or both.
Awesome. So you graduated from your master's program and you went on to become a health and education reporter at the Triangle Business Journal. So how do you get that, and then what did you do?
Yeah, so I had a mentor, Chris Roush, was one of my advisors at UNC, and he was really a business reporter at the school, and he had really come to business reporting through an interest in politics, and so he was an interesting person to work with because he point out like really politics is often in the United States moved by business. And so understanding business and economics is really important to reporting on politics in the United States. And then business is kind of a growing area of reporting and interest in the United States in the field of journalism. So I started working with him to focus on business reporting as a master's student, and really thinking about. I I did like worked for a while with a website, kind of new website called Footnoted, and it takes Securities and Exchange Commission filings and just extensively looks at the footnotes of those filings, and you find like fascinating things like, you know, corporate deals are put into the footnotes to try to hide them. Or like, let's say a guy's leaving and like the golden parachute kind of stuff is in the footnotes, or weird things like we're going to give this CEO like access to a private jet for the rest of his life, and we're going to buy him a new swimming pool, and all that kind of stuff is in the footnotes of those filings. So I worked for that website for a while when I was a master's student. So just learn like all these different avenues for discovering information and investigating things. So that was, the business background, reporting background was incredibly helpful for that stuff, and really learning to do deep investigations of organizations. So there's kind of a little bit of a demand for people trained in business reporting, and I know I wanted to stay in Raleigh, so I interviewed with and got an internship with the Triangle Business Journal, which is there's a network of business journals in most major cities in the United States. It's this um, kind of weekly paper that comes out, really focused on different sectors in each state, and really focused on the major metropolitan areas. So the one in Raleigh is the Triangle Business Journal, and once I did the internship there, they hired me as a full-time reporter on the health and really higher education beat. So I was covering the universities, which I'd spent a lot of time at, and healthcare. And I did not have a huge amount of experience in healthcare. So it was a really good education. One thing that's great about being a reporter is you get to just call up people and investigate things and ask questions. And so you learn a lot very quickly. And it's fascinating to get to just call people randomly and ask questions, because that's not a normal part of any other person's job.
Yeah, that sounds like it definitely was cool, and it's great that you mentioned that you got into this from like a mentorship and from an internship that led to this. How does one, like when you were in this position, did you learn mostly by from calling and talking to people, or more so like reading things online, or was it a combination of both?
I would say a combination. You do, when you're a reporter, you have to people say you have to like become an expert in a week in like a different topic. Like you might be covering, you know, um, something about a sewage spill one week, and you have to like learn everything about how that system works and what the possible damage is. And then the next week you're on to like securities fraud or something, and you have to learn everything about securities fraud. And so it's fun and interesting that you get to learn that stuff that quickly. So you do have to like talk to a lot of experts to really understand what's going on. Um, and then I did a ton of reading, background reading, to kind of understand what the context was, or the background on something, both old kind of news stories, but also just other kind of books and research articles about, I had academic training to do a lot of research. So that was sort of my nature, is to read the sort of history of everything I was trying to report on.
Okay, and I'm gonna guess that you have like a really fast reading pace. Is that true or not
I don't
really?
think so. I don't think I do. I don't think I
No.
really do. I read a lot. So I try like almost every spare minute. That's usually what I'm doing. Um, but I don't think I'm a very fast reader.
Okay.
honestly. I know a lot of people who are like much faster readers than I was. I did have to develop techniques for becoming a faster reader. I wonder if I have one of the books around here. But when we had to read, oh, well, like Black Reconstruction America, that's one of the books we had to read in my program, You had to read that you can't read every word in a week. Like you have to learn how to like do it quickly and be able to process that information. So that book a week and writing a research paper on it really refined my ability to get through a book quickly.
I can imagine. I can imagine. So, and as you said, like you read in every minute of the day that you're like not doing something. Are you reading like a bunch of different things? Are you reading? Do you read one book at a time? Do you read multiple books? No.
Multiple books, yeah.
How many books?
I know a lot of people can only read like they like to read one book at a time. Um, I'm almost always reading a fiction and nonfiction at the same time because it's more interesting, just different parts of your brain and stuff. Um, but most often, I would say like 3 books at a time, usually reading 2 nonfiction books and a fiction book, you know, kind of at the same time.
Yeah, that makes sense. And
Rotating between them.
yeah, I also read multiple books. I pick up one and I open another one, and then I'm like reading a couple of books at a time always as well.
My wife just like can't do that. She reads more than I do. She likes to read one book at a time.
Mm-hmm.
But she also like remembers every word she reads too, which I have trouble with that. So I do like to read multiple books, depending on what mood I'm in.
Fair enough. Fair enough. Okay. And did you have any funny journalist stories that you wanted to share?
Any funny journalism stories?
Yeah.
I don't know. Like most of the funny things that happen in journalism was the environment of journalism. Like it's unlike a lot of places in that like people are just like you're being yelled at all the time. Like your editors are like, you know, like maybe I would get the front page story, the editor wants to put what you're writing on the front page, and then your story's like not panning out. So you have to go into the editor and be like, maybe like the day before or the day of, and you're like, the sources just aren't coming through on this. It's not, and they'll be like, our editor used to be like, okay, well, we're just gonna put a blank spot where your headline was supposed to be, and Adam couldn't finish his work. Like you know that. So it's even more than journalism school. It's like a crucible where you learn to like get your work done and to write quickly, because otherwise people are like screaming at you in the newsroom that you have to get things done. So there's a lot of crying in newsrooms. I feel like maybe it's changed now because it's like such small newsrooms, but it was definitely an intense environment at the time.
Okay. And then speaking to that, like newsrooms and like newspapers and everything, as the communication on a whole has been kind of like shrinking or like shifting more virtually. What advice do you have for people that are interested in getting into like journalism?
I think, to me, I would say that people should be as versatile as possible. Like print journalists are really old school and absolutely hate the term like content creator, but a little bit that's kind of how you have to think. Like you're producing original content. I don't know how else to say it. Stories, information, and you have to be flexible about how you put it out into the world. So you really have to be fluent with producing podcasts, with um, doing videography, multimedia. Like the more flexible you can be, because people consume the information in different ways. But I don't think like no one's gonna lose their appetite for storytelling, for interviews, for information. It's just that people are constantly consuming in different ways and in different mediums and in different, maybe shorter for some mediums, longer for others. Um, but just being flexible about being able to produce in a lot of different ways, I think is important. so that you're ahead of the game when things are changing. You're more of an innovative thinker, and you have the technical ability to produce in these different ways. Um, I told my kids that a lot. Like, if you're going to do something like journalism, or if you're like acting, you should know how to work a camera, how to write a script. Like, you need to know how to do it all so that you can be flexible within that occupation or whatever to produce and deliver the content in different ways.
And then after this position, you moved on to become a policy analyst at the Health Access Coalition at the North Carolina Justice Center. So tell me, how do you get into this, and then what do you do in it?
That's a good question. So the North Carolina Justice Center is a policy organization and an advocacy organization. So it's an anti-poverty advocacy organization that works in, it came out of legal services, but it does all sorts of education work, tax policy, health policy, but I would say a lot more than just policy analysis, really on the ground organizing, being out in community, being at the legislature, all that stuff. So how I really got into it was that, I think I wanted to do more of the advocacy, and the sort of remove of journalism even was like a little too removed. So the academy was definitely too removed, but even journalism was a little too removed as well. Like, I was framing the problems, but I wasn't necessarily helping to solve them. And so I thought that the policy work could help solve some problems, and advocacy work. And that was, one of the best jobs I've ever had. It was like a dream job. Me and some of my coworkers would always say, I can't believe we get paid to do this because we just were essentially, you know, troublemakers, like advocates, just always in community, always thinking about how to move power, shift power, always thinking about how to make changes in the legislature, doing a ton of communicating. So we maintained a blog. We put out newsletters. We talked to the media all the time, holding press conferences. So it was just like every day was something very different. And essentially, we were trying to advance health policies that helped low income North Carolinians. And so that might be working on a certain insurance policy, could be, Medicaid policy. But really, I joined in 2008, right before Obama was elected. Then Obama was elected, so my entire job became about the Affordable Care Act in many ways, because that was the major health policy that was being pushed. And so making sure that huge federal policy adhered to, like, promoted consumer rights and really helped average people. Um, I don't really even like using the word consumer. It just became the way we sort of talked about it, but at the time, but just really what you're talking about is people, making sure that the bill really helped people on the ground, who are struggling in North Carolina. It's, I think at the time, people even have a hard time imagining what the world was like before the Affordable Care Act. But, like, at the time before the Affordable Care Act, you couldn't get an individual insurance plan on the market. You couldn't go out and just buy individual insurance that covered maternity care, which is crazy to me to even think about. I mean, now it's obviously a part of all insurance packages for most. And so at the time, there were just, you could also just be denied coverage. You could just be someone who they would not sell insurance to. So you could not go out and buy health insurance for almost any price, which was just crazy to think about now, given how much the Affordable Care Act has changed the world. But that sort of became a lot of my job, was to follow the Affordable Care Act, you know, work to make it better as the bills were moving through Congress, and to kind of talk about it a lot across North Carolina.
Okay. And what were some of the tactics that you used to like disrupt everything that was going on in this job? What is that?
That's a good question. Like one of the things we did, I would say one of the innovations we had. So the North Carolina legislature at the time had, well, I think they're just putting it in. Now a lot of the news media will like live broadcast legislative stuff out of the legislature. But at the time there weren't cameras or anything in the Senate or the House. So one of the things we started doing, and this is when Democrats were in charge of the legislature, we started bringing cameras to the legislature, and we would film them saying things that maybe were true, maybe not true, or just were things that you couldn't believe politicians were saying, but they thought they were just saying them behind closed doors. And, I mean, it was a big public meeting. It's not like you couldn't have cameras there. And then we would post them online. And that was like one of our early tactics that just the legislature got so angry with us, which is just funny if you think about. I mean, we were just putting their words online. Like, don't say things that aren't true in the legislature if you don't want it put online. But they just got so upset, and they started putting up signs in the chambers that said no cameras allowed. So I remember once there was a vote I was going to record, and I knew that they were going to try to probably kick me out because they didn't want me to have a camera there. So they would try to get the sergeant at arms to kick out people who carried cameras into there. But at the same day was a huge presentation of the Azalea Queen, which is like the debutante sort of ball Azalea Queen in Wilmington, North Carolina, that people put a lot of like work into, and the girls come with their families and are like presented at the Senate. Um, and so I was there the same day the Azalea Queen was being presented, and so I was there with my camera, and the sergeant at arms came to say, like, I knew he was coming straight for me to say, you have to get out of here with your camera. And so I start saying, like, oh, so we can't be here with cameras. Everybody has to leave who has cameras, and all these parents and families were getting so angry at the sergeant at arms because they were there, like, to record their family member. And I was there to record the vote. And so he like backed off. He was like, okay, no, okay, I understand. Everybody can stay. You guys can stay with your cameras. And we got to, but that was sort of one of our early tactics, was start to just use cameras, recording things, putting things online, which people weren't really doing in the advocacy community a lot. So we were kind of doing that early, but we kind of used all sorts of social media tactics, different things to raise awareness, and there was, I don't know if you remember the sort of, well, you may not have really been, I don't know how closely you were, if you were around following the Affordable Care Act debate, but it was just a crazy time. Um, and some of the folks across advocacy organizations formed the Billionaires for Wealth Care, and they would like dress up like billionaires, and like go around sort of as if they were campaigning against the Affordable Care Act. And they were just doing all this like street theater and stuff. So that was some funny moments in the during those debates and so forth, because people would get very confused about what side they were on. There's some interesting like tense moments and stuff, but that was a time, like, during the Affordable Care Act debate, there was an August recess when there were still multiple bills in Congress that would become the Affordable Care Act. And that was the '09, I think, August recess. And just, it was just crazy. I mean, I went around with members of Congress at the time in North Carolina to just explain the Affordable Care Act and the different bills that might become healthcare, a unified healthcare bill. And there were fist fights at the presentations. We had to have security. There were just like in Rocky Mount, we spoke at a school gym, and there was, probably 3,000 people, 2,000 people across the stands, and just people screaming on both sides. It was just a crazy time to be like. I got much better at public speaking at that time because now, when I'm public speaking, people aren't attacking me at least. So that was a crazy time in our politics.
Yeah, that would definitely teach you how to public speak well, for sure. And that's pretty crazy that you said that they wouldn't allow cameras in there and people were getting upset that you were just recording them talking when they shouldn't be saying what they're saying if they have a problem with them putting it online, which is quite a different world that we live in right today
It
than,
is.
than
It is,
then.
isn't it? Yeah.
Yeah, but
My my boss at the Justice Center, Adam Searing, um, the North Carolina Democrats during the recession after '08 were capping the children's health insurance program. They were capping enrollment, and um, he recorded the Senate budget presentation where they were saying we are increasing enrollment in the children's health insurance program. So he put on them saying that, and then he showed the budget that said we're capping enrollment in the children's health insurance program, and they just freaked out. Then he pointed out that what they were saying was not true.
wow,
They
that's
like they censored him and all this stuff. They were upset.
that's crazy.
It's just a
That's
different
crazy.
world now.
Yeah, that's absolutely crazy. So then after this role, you came to the Cape Reynolds Charitable Trust. Did you come in as a program officer or as a senior program officer?
I came in as a program officer.
All right, and tell me
Like you,
about
just like you.
tell me about this entire process coming to KPR or the trust, I should say.
Yeah, so I had really been working. I was at the Justice Center for a long time, for 8 years, I think, and was really working a lot on. It had turned into working so much on Medicaid expansion because North Carolina still has not expanded Medicaid under the Affordable Care Act. So it was very targeted in terms of what my work was every year. um, and so I was interested in. I was partly funded by the KB Reynolds Charitable Trust, which is one of the oldest, most respected kind of healthcare funders across the state. And so I knew that they were doing such great work in community. The trust had this Healthy Places initiative where they were working in rural communities. I had worked in a lot of those communities. I used to live in Eastern North Carolina when I was working at the Justice Center. So I saw the work of the trust. And then I also knew the trust was working more in things like Medicaid expansion because they were funding me to do some of that work. So I was interested in working on a lot of issues in a different way and like moving those issues forward in a different way than when you do advocacy, you have to focus all of your energy and effort into one narrow topic to try to move it forward because it's so hard to advance something like Medicaid expansion. Um, so the trust had an opening for a program officer, and I was interested in kind of doing something different and working on multiple issues across regions as opposed to just having that major focus on Affordable Care Act and Medicaid expansion.
Yeah, that makes sense. That makes sense. So, what did you do as a program officer?
Yeah. So the trust really, before I got there, underwent a change where they formulated this Healthy Places initiative to really do deep work in some rural communities, especially across the state, and to see if program officers getting much more deeply embedded in the community could help build different kinds of work and help give us different insights into community change process. Um, and so a lot of what I did when I joined the trust as opposed to just putting out funding opportunities and seeing what comes. There was still some of that at the trust, but it was also getting out into community, getting to know people working on different issues. You get to know everybody from, pastors at the church to the mayor of a town to, farmers in the community to the county manager. So you're really the hospital CEO. So you're getting to know a lot of different community members, a variety of working on a variety of different issues, and thinking about how can you bring folks together in different ways to make change to help them accomplish what health goals they're trying to accomplish. And so it was just very different in terms of probably how some philanthropies have operated in the past. I know some philanthropies have always operated in that way, but the trust previously had not. So it was interesting to join, and then you're really just getting to know the communities you're working in and really thinking about philanthropy as a tool for change. So I was directly an advocate before I came to the trust. So if something needed to change, I could go organize and like try to make the change and lobby and write op-eds and really try to make the change myself and get people to work together like just through organizing. In philanthropy, you're one step removed from that. And so I also spent a lot of time thinking about how that could work and really I have missed advocacy to some extent, in that you just feel like you could just go fix something. But right now you're really thinking about how can I use the tool of philanthropy to help other people fix things and to help other people build movements. And so you're one step removed. So really thinking about that has been, I think, another thing that I spent a lot of time thinking about when I first joined is how do you get yourself sort of out of the advocacy space and mentality, and think about philanthropy as a tool, and then getting to know community and really getting to know like just the nuts and bolts of philanthropy. As you know, the program officer has its own, just like a journalist has a toolbox that they have to learn. Philanthropy has processes and all that you have to learn in its own language and everything. So that was really what I was getting to do at the beginning of becoming a program officer.
Okay, thank you for sharing that. And then, so you've been there throughout the process of all our strategies changing to what they are now and what I've come in to learn and know. So talk about how the change in strategy at the trust has evolved to focus more on like equity, community, and systems change work since you've been here at the trust.
Yeah, so when I came to the trust, we were working deeply in some communities, and we had the issues broadly that we were trying to impact. For example, we might say we want to work on substance misuse in these counties, or we want to work on um, a more equitable food system. That may be not how we phrased it, but in this community, we might have just called it obesity reduction or something, in these communities. And that's kind of how we thought about it. So we might have a funding opportunity to work on obesity reduction in certain communities, and then you might be funding everything from like a community garden to you know like the a after school program that focuses on obesity reduction. We funded the walking classroom that gets students recorders and they can walk while they have a lesson. So the teacher will take them walking. So there's all these different things we might fund in that, but it wasn't necessarily what I think changed kind of shortly after I got here was Dr. Laura Gerald, our current president, arrived. And what she was really thinking about is equity and equity as an outcome. And so we really started thinking about, okay, so you're working on substance misuse in this community. What's the goal? You might be working on equitable food system in this community, but what's the goal? You really have to name your goals to be transparent to community, to help build public will towards addressing a certain issue. And you have to follow the outcome, because intent is one thing, but outcomes are a different thing. So you may not mean to create um, a school plan that segregates all your schools, but if that's the outcome, you need to change something. So well-meaning people can still produce and reproduce disparities. And so one thing I think that changed was really like we started focusing on how do you create goals and how do you focus on outcomes, because we hadn't named that previously. We just said we were working on these issues in these communities. So we spent time really working with community. And one of the things that has come out of that is really we're helping communities uncover what they want to accomplish. We're helping communities through that same process of identifying goals and following their progress and following outcomes, so that it's not just us imposing it. It's really like helping the community create goals more organically that are based in the community. Um, and then I think that sort of focus on equity has been much more intentional, more recently. So really thinking about getting general operating support to grassroots organizations, really getting different voices at the table, and even getting different types of groups, Black-led organizations, Latinx-led organizations, um, Indian organizations, like the Lumbee in the Southeast, to lead some of the change efforts, really to have a focus on those communities that have been most impacted by disparities and have them lead the change efforts in the community.
Okay. Yeah, thank you for sharing that, and I'm glad that you all did all that hard work, so I can just plug into it and learn and
Now
travel.
the hard work really starts.
True, true, true.
Trying to make change.
Yeah. So you're currently director of programs. So what is so you're a program officer, then you're a senior program officer, now you're director of programs. What has changed? What has evolved as you've taken on these new positions?
So I was a very short time a senior program officer. So, but really, like the senior program officer is really, I was more taking the lead on certain issues like Medicaid expansion and other kind of issues across the trust. Um, and then as director of programs, I'm sort of trying to take another step back, kind of like with advocacy, took a step back to be a program officer and work in philanthropy, and now trying to take another step back where, um, I work with the program team and the program officers to figure out how can we, again, a program officer is like out in community directly making all of the connections. And then in my position, I'm hoping to support the program officers and think about as a program team with all of our other teammates, like our communications director, director of evaluation, all those other great members of the trust we have. How can we collectively do something greater to really push change in the communities, to really help the communities accomplish what they want to accomplish, and really take folks through that process of identifying, a system or policy they want to change, you know, measuring their progress towards that, organizing around a certain issue, building community will, and like thinking about the steps in that process and how we get folks there, and working to support the coordination between all the different moving parts of the trust to make sure we're supporting community and making that happen. So that's really, and then I would say the other thing I hope to do as director of programs is really be thinking to what we can say more broadly about philanthropic strategy and things that we're learning. And of course, with our learning and impact director and our communications director, really thinking about what can we be saying about change and what can we be saying about philanthropy and how philanthropy can contribute to community change. Um, I think to some extent, the analysis of philanthropy, in my opinion, just has been very shallow in the United States. Like, we just haven't, thought very deeply and critically about how philanthropy can make change. But if you think about, as we've talked about before, every social movement, political movement in the United States, was funded by philanthropy. If you think about different types of philanthropy, there's like grassroots kind of philanthropy. There's sort of fundraising um, through like arts activities or through concerts and stuff. And then there's philanthropy, like institutional philanthropy of private foundations, community foundations. And that combination of raising money has funded everybody from the abolitionists to the civil rights movement to the progressive movement. Like, all of these different things were movements were funded in different ways. And so thinking about what are the lessons from that, how you can reproduce parts of that, how you can not reproduce the harmful parts of that, and you can replicate the parts that really made progress in the United States, I think are things that I hope we can think more deeply about as philanthropy. And I think there are some people who are doing that in the academic setting. And so I hope we can, I hope we can contribute to that.
Yeah, I like that a lot, and I do think there's a lot to learn and continue to learn and continue to share how we learn to better position philanthropy to do the good work that it has the potential to do for a lot of the communities out there. Mm. So, now, is there any advice that you would give to someone trying to come into public health philanthropy as a program officer? What type of advice would you give them?
Someone kind of interested in getting into the field.
Yeah.
Um, so to me, I have a hard time maybe sometimes giving advice about a particular job. Um, my advice is usually to figure out what you want to change, and what you want to do, what you want to accomplish in life, and what's like your mission statement, you know, and then look to the best ways to do that. The organizations that you think could be helping, you could be making the biggest difference through. And so that may be a philanthropy, but where you live or where you're interested in living or where you're working or where you're trying to make an impact, maybe philanthropy isn't the place that's really doing that. And so maybe it's a policy organization for you or where you are. Maybe it's just like a nonprofit that you need to get them to think differently, or maybe it's you're working as an organizer or something else. Um, Maybe it isn't as an academic, really framing the conversation. But to me, I think the way to sort out, and to get these different jobs is really, for me, has been following the mission, as opposed to just like, I never thought I wanted to work in philanthropy. I never thought about that as a job. You're probably like that too. Like, a lot of people don't even think about it as a sector that you would be working in until I was funded by philanthropy, and I rose to a position in a nonprofit where I was directly talking to the funders. Because even when I was an advocate before I was actually managing grants, I still didn't have a lot of contact with funders and didn't think about their role much until I was talking to them. And then I thought, like, these folks have a lot of say over how things are arranged. They have a lot of impact over what happens and doesn't happen. And they can really change the nature of some of these movements. And that's when I thought of it as, well, that's kind of in some ways influencing even the advocacy I can be doing. And so maybe I should be thinking about that as well, as a career option. Um, but you still, if you have a certain mission, you wouldn't want to just work for any philanthropy. And that's something that I think people do is, like with anything, they kind of because philanthropy can be mysterious, people lump it all together as if foundations are just one thing. But they're like nonprofits, they're like people, they're like everything. Like there are different philanthropies that are trying to accomplish different things. And some of them are about movement building, some of them are about systems change and moving things, and some of them are not with that agenda, and some may be very much on a charity mission, or some may be trying to roll back what I would think of as rolling back progress. So philanthropies are all over the map as well, just like nonprofits, just like politicians. And so it's really figuring out who aligns with what you're trying to accomplish, and then, you know, contributing what you can contribute to that organization. I've had a weird kind of background, but like you and I have very different backgrounds to some extent in terms of how we got here. And that's true of all the rest of our coworkers, just very different. And that's what's cool about philanthropy is people are coming from all sorts of different backgrounds and fields trying to accomplish something. And so, I wouldn't say you have to have a certain background or training necessarily. It's more like, what's your mission, what's your calling, what are you trying to accomplish, and does a certain philanthropy align with that, or do you have the potential to change the organization and try to get the organization to align with better values.
Yeah, I like that a lot. I definitely think a lot of people definitely try to dive into things and not really align themselves with the mission and what the organization is truly doing, and to think about it holistically is definitely very beneficial. And maybe looking back at it and seeing like how can you contribute, what values and skills you have to that organization. And I definitely will have the rest of the team on the podcast at some point in time.
Okay, good.
What once Nora gives me the okay, and
Yeah,
so we can hear about their stories as
that's
well.
awesome because we have a great group.
Yeah, oh yeah, we have a dream team for sure.
I think
So
kind of like when you're asking about journalism, like with all of these things too, like you just want to develop your technical skills and knowledge. So the more things you can do, the more you can contribute to any organization. So I don't say, I'm not known for being a tech person, but anything you can learn, just like you're contributing with the podcast, and um, folks are writers, folks may be, love spreadsheets and data, folks may love community organizing, like all of those things. Develop a skill set within organizing, develop skills within communications, and all of those things can help you no matter where you are trying to align yourself with. If you have technical skills, people are going to need those.
absolutely, that's some great advice right there. And before I move you on to the last section of the show, the Furious Five, I just want to ask, where would you like to see yourself in the future?
Well, that's a good question. I think I love the trust. So if I can keep moving philanthropy in the right direction, then definitely, as long as Dr. Gerald's at the trust, especially.
Completely understand that. I know Adam has a tendency. I've heard that even when he's on vacation, he's not on vacation. He's always ready to answer messages and things like that. So I
I
definitely
just don't.
understand.
I just don't like to have to answer a whole bunch of emails when I get back. So
That is also fair. That is also fair. All right, so moving you on to the Furious Five, the five questions I ask all guests.
okay.
Number one, what advice would you give to a student trying to pursue a career in public health?
I think, well, like I said, really think about what you're trying to accomplish and what your mission is, and be open to whether it's a public health department, academia, advocacy. Just try to find something that aligns with your values and develop your technical skills. So any, software you can learn to use, any um, organizing tools that can help you with collecting information, all of those things, ways of communicating, all of those technical skills, I think make you more, valuable to whatever organization you want to pursue.
Okay, thank you. Number two, if you were talking to someone wanting to get into your position, what advice would you give them?
That's a good question. I think, to, again, I would say to really just think about what positions, either volunteering or whatever it is, that begins the process of, I think of myself as have worked in advocacy and organizing, and so there are lots of opportunities for that. So and that becomes very valuable if you want to work in philanthropy or anything else, if you have that kind of background of building movements, doing policy analysis. Um, and there's lots of, I think, opportunities to do that without having to get employed somewhere. And so that kind of is helpful because you can get the experience through volunteer work, campaign work, organizing, community building, all of those things let you get involved without necessarily having to get a job through that.
Okay.
I would
Number
say, I would just say, like, for example, I had a friend who was a FedEx driver, and he just started but he just loved policy and organizing, and so he started at night organizing policy get-togethers for the community, and the community would get together and talk about pertinent policies of the day, both in local government, state government. Um, and he just kind of leveraged that to become a tremendous community organizer for Democracy North Carolina. But he kind of took what he was doing, which was FedEx driver, which was a good job, but his passion was like organizing. So he just started doing that on the side and built that skill set. And then people, like, he was in demand after that because people are like, oh, he's like an organizer at heart. So then multiple organizations were trying to get him to organize for them. So that's the kind of thing I think that's helpful for the position, I would say, as a program officer or something, is valuable experience.
Okay.
Good time. That was a long answer.
Wow. Okay. And then number
Edit
three.
that down.
What's something you're working on improving in your life right now?
Something I'm working on improving.
Mm-hmm.
I think that I'm definitely trying to get back to writing more. Was something that I did very regularly as an advocate, and I've had less time to do now. So, really, I think refining and getting back to my writing and research to some extent. I haven't had a lot of time to research things. So, I would say that.
Well, I hope you do get back into that. Um, Number four, professionally, do you recommend anything?
Professionally, do I recommend? What do you mean?
It could be a book, could be a
Oh,
podcast, a YouTube, any
yes,
kind of resource.
yeah. So there's an interesting, there's a scholar named Megan Ming Francis who's at Harvard, and created since I'm assuming people who watch your podcast are fans of podcasts, has a class on philanthropy and social movements. And they have a website where the students created a bunch of podcast episodes about philanthropy and different social movements. So for our, you know, um, field, I think that's a really cool thing to listen to those podcasts and kind of get. It's with different philanthropic leaders, community organizers, and thinking about how philanthropy can communicate or can contribute to social change. I think also, I'm just like looking at it here. I've got the light of freedom is like for people who are interested in organizing. This is, I would say, the Bible. Last weekend before last, Bob Moses died, and tremendous leader, really like one of the people who, helped, was the like organizer of the Mississippi Democratic Freedom Summer and a lot of the organizing that went on in Mississippi for voting rights. And this really is about the organizing tradition in the Mississippi freedom struggle. But for community organizers, this is there's probably no better book than that one. So I would also recommend that.
Okay, awesome. Well, thank you for sharing that. And last but not least, where can people connect with you?
People can call my cell or email me at adam@kbr.org, or my cell is 336-971-7944. I give my cell out all over the state, so call me or text me directly.
That's awesome. Well, now it's going to be internationally, so maybe you'll get some calls from other places as well.
I know the profile is going to blow up after this.
Yeah, absolutely, Will, absolutely. Well, thank you so much for coming on and sharing your story and your insights. I definitely appreciate it myself, and I know other people are going to appreciate it as well.
Yeah, thanks for doing it. That's great.
Yeah, my pleasure. And then just housekeeping items. Thank you everyone for watching and listening. Be sure that you subscribe, that you like, that you review, and you share this with a friend. And if you want to support the Public at Millennial, you can go to buymeacoffee.com/the PH Millennial. And I will see you all next week. You all will see me all next week.